Teresa Jones, a 42-year-old woman, had built her life around structure and routine. As a bookkeeper for a modest construction company, she spent her days immersed in numbers, spreadsheets, and deadlines. She was efficient, detail-oriented, and respected by her colleagues. Yet beneath her calm and composed exterior was a woman grappling with a profound sense of emptiness. Her life at home, which once brought her joy, had devolved into a daily battle to endure the unendurable. Her husband, James, a mechanic by trade, had once been a source of love and support. In the early years of their marriage, he showered her with affection, often surprising her with small acts of kindness, a note tucked into her bag, a thoughtful gesture after a long day. But those days were long gone. Over the years, James had grown distant, hardened by the pressures of life and work. His temper, once rare and fleeting, had become a constant presence in their home. Small disagreements over household chores or finances often escalated into shouting matches and increasingly into violence. The man she had once loved now seemed like a stranger, his outbursts unpredictable and his hands too quick to raise in anger. Teresa bore the brunt of his wrath in silence, telling herself it was for the sake of their 3 children. Her eldest, a teenage boy on the cusp of adulthood, had begun to sense the tension in the house but remained silent, retreating into his own world. The younger 2, a pair of girls with bright smiles and boundless energy, were blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. Teresa clung to the idea that keeping the family together was the best thing for her children, even as the toll it took on her became harder to ignore. At work, her colleagues noticed the changes in her demeanor. Teresa, once vibrant and quick to share a laugh, had become withdrawn. She moved through the office like a shadow of her former self, avoiding conversations that delved beyond the surface. Sheila, a coworker with a sharp eye for detail and a knack for reading people, was the first to approach her. Sheila had a way of cutting through pleasantries, and one afternoon, she casually suggested that Teresa try something new, a dating site, not for anything serious, but just to remind herself of the life that existed beyond her crumbling marriage. The idea startled Teresa. It felt risky, almost reckless, to even consider. For weeks, she dismissed the thought, pushing it to the back of her mind. But Sheila's words lingered, echoing in moments when she felt the weight of her unhappiness most acutely. After a particularly brutal argument with James, during which he had struck her over a minor disagreement, Teresa found herself sitting at her kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. Her phone rested in her hand, and without fully understanding why, she opened her browser and began searching. The process of creating a profile was both nerve-wracking and oddly exhilarating. She chose her words carefully, crafting a description that was honest but not too revealing. She uploaded a photo of herself that she had taken months earlier, one in which she looked confident and radiant, so different from how she felt now. Her hands trembled as she hit submit, and for a moment, she considered deleting the account altogether. But something stopped her, a small spark of defiance that she hadn't felt in years. Days passed with little activity, and Teresa began to wonder if she had made a mistake. Then, one evening, a notification appeared. A man named Mark had sent her a message. His profile was striking. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with a strong, athletic build and an easy smile that suggested charm and confidence. His bio was brief but intriguing, mentioning his love for fitness, travel, and meaningful conversations. He admitted that he was married but emphasized that he was seeking connections that didn't come with strings attached. The directness of his message caught her off guard, but it also intrigued her. Their conversation started innocently enough, exchanging pleasantries and small talk. But as the days went on, their messages became longer, more personal. Mark had a way of making her feel seen, of drawing out parts of herself that she had buried under years of duty and repression. She found herself looking forward to their exchanges, stealing moments during her lunch breaks or late at night to read his latest message and craft her response. For the first time in years, Teresa felt desired, not just as a mother or a wife, but as a woman. The idea of meeting him in person began as a distant fantasy, something she never believed she would act on. But as their connection deepened, the thought became harder to resist. Mark suggested a meeting, assuring her that he would handle the details discreetly. Teresa hesitated, her mind racing with doubts and fears. Yet, the allure of escaping her reality, even for a few hours, was too strong to ignore. With a mixture of trepidation and anticipation, she agreed, setting in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. Teresa spent the entire week leading up to the meeting in a haze of nervous anticipation. Every message from Mark brought a mix of excitement and dread, her thoughts bouncing between fantasies of escape and the harsh reality of her everyday life. When he confirmed the details, an upscale hotel just outside the city with a reservation already made in his name, her resolve solidified. This was her chance to step out of the suffocating confines of her marriage and rediscover a part of herself she thought had been lost forever. On the day of the meeting, Teresa prepared with meticulous care. She went shopping, selecting a set of elegant lingerie that she hadn't dared wear in years. She spent hours on her hair and makeup, crafting an image of confidence and allure. Her reflection in the mirror looked unfamiliar yet invigorating, as if she had shed the weight of her past, even if just for one night. Before leaving, she told her husband she was visiting her sister overnight, ensuring that he wouldn't wait for her return. With a suitcase packed for the pretense, she set off for the hotel. As she approached the hotel, her heart raced. The building loomed large and intimidating, its glowing sign casting reflections on the nearby street. The receptionist greeted her warmly, handing her the key to the suite with a knowing smile. The room itself was as Mark had described, dim lighting, the soft glow of candles, a chilled bottle of champagne waiting on the table, and gentle music playing from hidden speakers. It was a setting designed for seduction, every detail carefully curated to ease her into the moment. Yet, as she sat on the edge of the bed, a glass of champagne in hand, she felt the first twinges of doubt. Her mind replayed the messages they had exchanged, her imagination filling in the gaps of Mark's life that he had left vague. She had constructed an image of him in her head, a confident, caring man with just enough mystery to intrigue her. But when the knock came at the door, what she saw shattered every expectation. Standing in the doorway was not Mark but her 21-year-old nephew, Carter. The shock hit her like a physical blow, and she froze, unable to process what she was seeing. Carter stepped inside with an unnerving calm, closing the door behind him. He looked older than she remembered, his boyish features replaced by a sharper, more confident demeanor. His eyes held an unsettling mix of familiarity and detachment, and his posture exuded control. Teresa's initial reaction was to shout, her voice shaking with confusion and anger. But Carter remained composed, his tone cold and steady as he gestured for her to sit down. When she refused, he stepped closer, his presence commanding, and placed a fresh glass of champagne in her hand. Reluctantly, she complied, her thoughts racing as she tried to piece together how this had happened. Carter explained everything with a disarming clarity. He had seen her profile on the dating site, recognizing her instantly. The realization that his aunt, someone he had admired and secretly desired for years, was seeking an affair had sparked something in him. What began as curiosity had quickly turned into a calculated plan. He had created the Mark persona, knowing exactly how to appeal to her vulnerabilities and desires. Now, standing in the room he had prepared, he revealed his intentions with a chilling honesty. Teresa felt trapped, her emotions oscillating between outrage and an inexplicable fascination. Carter's confidence was unnerving, a stark contrast to the shy boy she had known growing up. He was no longer the awkward teenager who had lingered in her periphery, but a self-assured man who had turned the situation to his advantage. When he threatened to expose her secrets, to her husband, her children, and anyone else who might listen, if she didn't comply with his wishes, the full weight of her predicament hit her. Fear coursed through her, paralyzing her ability to act. She wanted to leave, to run far from the room and the trap that had ensnared her, but Carter's words held her in place. He moved closer, his voice softening, and the intensity of his gaze stirred something in her that she couldn't explain. It was as if his dominance had awakened a part of her that she had buried under years of neglect and suppression. Against her better judgment, she stayed. The lines between coercion and consent blurred as her fear gave way to a complex mix of emotions. She hated herself for the thoughts that crept into her mind, for the way her body responded to his touch despite the circumstances. The vulnerability he had exploited became the very thing that bound her to the moment, and she found herself unable to resist. Teresa returned home the morning after her encounter with Carter, her emotions a swirling storm of conflict. On the surface, she appeared calm and collected, slipping back into her household routine with practiced ease. Yet beneath the facade, she grappled with a strange mix of shame and exhilaration. The events of the previous night played out in her mind with a vividness that both thrilled and unsettled her. For the first time in years, she felt noticed, desired, and even powerful, though the source of those feelings left a bitter taste. James barely acknowledged her return, absorbed in his work and the endless stream of minor grievances that defined his days. His indifference gave Teresa a small measure of relief. She moved through her day mechanically, attending to her children, tidying the house, and preparing dinner, all while stealing moments to process what had happened. Though her body went through the motions, her mind was elsewhere, caught between the weight of her guilt and the undeniable pull of the memory. A few days later, the equilibrium she had tried to maintain was disrupted when Carter reached out to her again. His message was brief but pointed, reminding her of their encounter and suggesting they meet again. Teresa felt her heart race as she read his words. She told herself she wouldn't respond, that the best course of action was to cut all ties and pretend it had never happened. But as the hours passed, the fear of his potential retaliation loomed larger. Carter had made it clear he held the power to expose her, and that power was a leash she couldn't shake. Worse still, she found herself drawn to the idea of seeing him again, unable to deny the illicit thrill he had awakened in her. Teresa's resolve crumbled, and she agreed to meet him. What began as a single encounter soon became a pattern. Carter manipulated her with precision, using her fears and insecurities to maintain control. He knew how to play on her guilt, framing their meetings as inevitable, something she couldn't escape even if she tried. At the same time, he fed her just enough affection and attention to keep her ensnared. Teresa, desperate to hold on to the spark of life she had rediscovered, allowed herself to be pulled deeper into his web. Their meetings became a regular occurrence, hidden beneath layers of lies and secrecy. Carter proved adept at planning their encounters, choosing locations and times that minimized the risk of discovery. Teresa grew bolder in her deceptions, inventing excuses to leave the house and carefully erasing any evidence of her absences. Yet, the strain of leading a double life began to take its toll. She became distracted at work, her usually sharp focus dulled by the constant worry of being found out. Her colleagues noticed the change, and even Sheila, who had encouraged her to explore the dating site, began to question what was going on. At home, the cracks in her composure grew harder to hide. Her children, though young, picked up on her distant behavior. They asked why she seemed tired or why she spent so much time away from home, questions Teresa brushed aside with strained smiles and vague reassurances. James, too, began to notice the shifts in her demeanor. Though he was often consumed by his own frustrations, he couldn't ignore the way Teresa seemed more withdrawn, her responses clipped and her attention elsewhere. His suspicions, once vague and fleeting, began to solidify into something more concrete. Teresa's guilt became an ever-present shadow, following her through every aspect of her life. While she had initially justified her actions as a way to reclaim her happiness, the reality was far messier. Each encounter with Carter left her both exhilarated and hollow, the weight of their secret pressing down on her with increasing intensity. She tried to convince herself that she was in control, that she could end things at any time, but deep down, she knew the truth. Carter's hold on her was unshakable, and her life was slipping further out of her grasp. As the days turned into weeks, the walls began to close in. Teresa found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, fearing that someone would uncover her secret. The fear was compounded by the growing tension at home. James's once passive indifference had given way to quiet suspicion, his glances lingering on her a little too long, his tone sharper when he asked where she had been. Teresa knew it was only a matter of time before her carefully constructed facade crumbled, and the life she had fought so hard to maintain was irreparably shattered. The secret she had tried to contain was no longer just a weight, it was a ticking time bomb. Teresa's routine of deceit began to unravel on an unassuming evening, marking the end of her carefully maintained secrecy. After another clandestine meeting with Carter, she drove home, her thoughts preoccupied with the lingering tension of their last conversation. Carter had become increasingly demanding, and the fear that once bound her to him had started to morph into resentment. Yet, she couldn't sever the connection, knowing full well the consequences he could unleash if she tried. She didn't notice the light still on in her house or the silhouette of James waiting by the window. When Teresa entered the house, the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. James was sitting at the kitchen table, her phone clutched tightly in his hand. His expression was unreadable at first, but his silence carried a weight that made her stop in her tracks. He didn't need to say much. The phone was open, the messages between her and Carter laid bare. Teresa felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what he had discovered. The photographs, the flirtatious exchanges, the plans for their meetings, it was all there, undeniable evidence of her betrayal. James's reaction was swift and explosive. His voice, usually gruff but controlled, rose to a pitch of rage that shook the walls. He demanded answers, his words laced with venom and disbelief. Teresa, caught off guard and paralyzed by fear, stumbled through half-formed explanations. She tried to rationalize her actions, to deflect the blame onto their failing marriage, but the words came out hollow. Every attempt she made to justify herself only seemed to fuel his anger further. He accused her of destroying their family, of shaming him, of being unfit to remain in their home. As the argument escalated, James's threats grew more menacing. He told her he would tell the children everything, that he would ensure they saw her as a villain and not a mother. He hinted at throwing her out of the house, leaving her with nothing. The power dynamic that had always favored him now became a weapon he wielded mercilessly, and Teresa felt the walls closing in. She had anticipated guilt, even shame, but she hadn't expected the confrontation to be so immediate and devastating. Carter, sensing something was wrong when Teresa didn't respond to his follow-up messages, began calling her incessantly. His name flashing on the phone screen only added fuel to James's fury. At first, Teresa ignored the calls, too consumed by the confrontation to even think about answering. But when Carter's persistence became impossible to ignore, she picked up, retreating to another room under James's seething glare. Carter's voice on the other end was calm, almost detached, as he assured her he could handle the situation. He told her to trust him, to let him deal with James. Teresa's stomach turned at the thought, realizing that Carter's intervention might only escalate the chaos. James, overhearing parts of the conversation, grew even more agitated. The idea of Carter, a much younger man, someone he knew and possibly trusted, being involved in his wife's infidelity pushed him to a breaking point. His threats became more specific, directed not just at Teresa but at Carter as well. He vowed to confront him, to make him pay for what he had done. The intensity of his rage left Teresa shaken, and for the first time, she feared not just for her marriage but for everyone involved. The following days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. James's anger simmered just below the surface, erupting in sharp comments and cold stares. Teresa tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the sake of the children, but her efforts were futile. The kids sensed the shift in the household, their once lively conversations reduced to uneasy silences. Teresa's guilt weighed heavily on her, but so did her fear. Carter continued to reach out, his messages becoming more erratic as he insisted on meeting to discuss the situation. Teresa knew that any interaction with him now would only make things worse, but she couldn't bring herself to cut him off entirely. James, meanwhile, became increasingly paranoid. He began monitoring Teresa's every move, checking her phone and questioning her about her whereabouts. His mistrust seeped into every interaction, poisoning even the most mundane moments of their lives. The balance of power in their marriage, once tenuously maintained, had completely collapsed. Teresa was no longer a partner or even an equal, she was a liability, a source of humiliation that James was determined to control or eliminate. In the midst of this turmoil, Teresa began to see the full extent of the damage her choices had caused. What had started as an escape from her unhappy marriage had spiraled into a nightmare that threatened to consume everyone around her. The fear of Carter exposing their affair was now matched by the fear of James's retribution. She realized that no matter what she did, the life she had tried to hold together was irreparably broken. All that remained was the question of how much more she was willing to lose before it all came crashing down. Teresa and Carter agreed to meet one final time, hoping to find a way out of the chaos their relationship had unleashed. The location was chosen carefully, a desolate parking lot on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by overgrown weeds and abandoned structures. It was the kind of place where no one would think to look for them, a fitting setting for the clandestine conversation they needed to have. Teresa arrived first, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with fears and doubts. She had no clear plan, only a desperate need to regain control of her crumbling life. Carter pulled in moments later, his car's headlights slicing through the darkness. He stepped out with his usual air of confidence, but there was a tension in his posture that betrayed his unease. They exchanged few words at first, the gravity of the situation hanging heavy between them. Carter tried to reassure her, insisting that he could handle James and that their connection was worth fighting for. Teresa, however, was less certain. The risks had grown too great, and the consequences too severe. She wanted to believe there was a way to move forward, but the weight of her guilt and fear was suffocating. As they spoke, Teresa became increasingly agitated, her voice rising as she laid out the stakes. Carter, in turn, grew defensive, his calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. The argument escalated, their voices echoing in the emptiness around them. Neither noticed the car that had pulled in silently, its engine cutting off as its driver watched from the shadows. James had been following Teresa for days, his suspicions finally giving way to certainty. He had seen the messages on her phone, tracked her movements, and pieced together the truth. His anger simmered as he sat in his car, watching the scene unfold. When he finally stepped out, it was with a singular purpose. In his hand, he held a firearm, a crude and terrifying symbol of his rage. The confrontation was immediate and explosive. James stormed toward them, his voice a roar of accusations and threats. Teresa froze, her mind unable to process the sudden shift. Carter tried to interject, his tone firm but measured, attempting to de-escalate the situation. James, however, was beyond reason. His grip on the gun tightened as he directed his fury at both of them, his words a venomous mix of betrayal and humiliation. The tension reached a breaking point when Carter, in a moment of recklessness, stepped closer to James. The movement was meant to assert control, but it only inflamed James further. In the chaos that followed, a struggle ensued. Teresa screamed, pleading for them to stop, but her voice was drowned out by the scuffle. The gun went off, the sound reverberating through the night like a thunderclap. When the dust settled, Carter was on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. His body was still, his face frozen in a mixture of shock and pain. Teresa fell to her knees beside him, her cries piercing the silence. James stood over them, the gun hanging limply at his side, his expression one of grim realization. For a moment, no one moved, the enormity of what had happened sinking in. James's composure cracked as the weight of his actions became clear. Without a word, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Teresa alone with the lifeless body of the man who had once held her captive in more ways than one. She watched in stunned silence as James drove away, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. When the police arrived, summoned by Teresa's frantic call, they found her sitting beside Carter's body, her face pale and streaked with tears. She answered their questions mechanically, her voice devoid of emotion. By the time they began their investigation, James was already gone, his whereabouts unknown. In the days that followed, Teresa's life fell apart entirely. Her children were placed in the care of her sister, as the authorities deemed her unfit to provide for them amidst the turmoil. The home she had fought so hard to maintain became an empty shell, a reminder of the life she had destroyed. Carter's death and James's disappearance became headlines, the scandal casting a shadow over her name. Teresa sat alone in a small, dimly lit room, holding an old family photograph. Her expression was one of deep sorrow and regret as she stared at the image of a younger, happier version of herself. The promise of freedom and happiness that had driven her choices now felt like a cruel illusion. She was left with nothing but the fragments of her past and the daunting task of rebuilding her life from the ashes. Whether she could find redemption or trust again remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she faced the truth of her actions and the price they had exacted.